Well, Eric, I want to welcome you on the program, and I want to talk to you a little bit about the Middle East. I know that J.P. McCarthy on his Focus program has periodically in the past invited you to talk about the Middle East. So I want to know, what is it that you know about it, or how are you an expert on the Middle East before I begin to talk with you about that topic?
The main topics that I covered with J.P. McCarthy on the Middle East program, or the Focus program that he has, were mainly political and economical topics of the Arab-Israeli conflict, or the war that took place in 1982 between undeclared war between Israel and Syria, regarding the missile crisis that were placed by Syria and Lebanon, and later on regarding the oil situation.
How do you come by this knowledge of the Middle East?
Well, I was born in the Middle East. My father moved from here to the Middle East and to Damascus, and I'm ethnically of Syrian background. I was born and raised in the Middle East, and about 10-15 years ago, due to my engineering background, I started traveling back and forth, mainly to the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, to help and assist the countries in that part of the world in acquiring technology. And I was involved in transfer of industrial know-how, mainly in electronics and in the glass industry.
And you speak Arabic, I take it?
I speak Arabic, of course.
That was your language in Damascus, Syria?
That was my language in Damascus, Syria. Also French, because Syria was a colony of France during World War II, or between World War I till the end of World War II. So in school, I went to a public parochial as well as public schools where we learned Arabic and French.
Well, Eric, I want to talk a little bit about the Middle East in religious terms. I know I'm not bringing you on here as a theologian, but one of the terrible ironies, I suppose, of history is the role that religions have played in conflicts, strife, wars, crusades, inquisitions, that sort of thing. We usually think of religion as having the job of humanizing people, helping people to live in greater harmony, to create peace and justice and so on. And yet, very often it has worked just the opposite. And I think we see in the Middle East a terrible example of this, because we have three great religions represented there: the Christians, the Jewish community, and Islam, the Muslims. And it seems as though the religious differences are often a big part of the conflicts that occur there, which is a terrible irony. And there are theologians who think that we really are not going to get the kind of peace in the world that we want until we're able to achieve some sort of religious reconciliation. So that becomes an important aspect of it, at least in my mind.
Yes, it's quite ironic, although the Middle East is the cradle of man civilization, also is the cradle of the three monotheistic religion: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And all these religions originated from the desert of the Middle East, Palestine, Syria, Saudi Arabia. It evolved. We see that the Middle East at the time of Christ was to a great extent in a Jewish denomination. Then at the conversion of Paul went on to preach and convert Jews to Christianity. And at the birth of Islam, the first conquest or first move from Arabia was to conquer Syria, and people in that part of the world, majority of them became Muslim for religious as well as for financial reasons, because taxes were levied on non-Muslim people at that time. So we see that the Middle East evolved religiously from Judaism to Christianity to the present day as a predominantly Muslim region of the world.
Maybe we can look a little bit at those religions theologically, because there is a great commonness in them. As you suggested, they are all monotheistic religions. They all believe in one God and the same God. The Jewish community talks about Yahweh in their scriptures, and Jesus talked about Abba, the one he addressed as Father, to specify his own understanding of Yahweh. And of course, Islam speaks about Allah, the one to whom we are to surrender, the supreme judge and Lord of all of history. But this is really the same God. It's very clear in the scriptures, because we in the Christian community hold dear the Hebrew scriptures. We make them part of our Bible, often calling that the Old Testament. I think it's much better to call it the Hebrew Scriptures. And of course in the Quran, which dates from the 6th century A.D., after the time of Christ, we also have large sections which are very similar to what we find in the Judeo-Christian Bible. So I think there really ought to be sort of a common bonding that we find there. In fact, we are seeing these days, at least at the theological level, a lot of dialogue which ought to help us. For example, Christian theologians are very open, of course, to the prophets in these other religions. Christians say, well, Moses is a great prophet, that Abraham is our father in faith. Well, he's the father in faith of the Jews, the Christians, and really of the Muslims as well. So, and we're able clearly to say that we consider Muhammad to be a great prophet, one who really rose above the culture of his times. He was much more humane and than many of the people that he was associated with, preached a very high ethic. As Pope John Paul II recently said, that he, in addressing Muslims, he said, well, I respect your religion because it has such an interest in promoting peace and justice. And so that's something that often not thought of, but the current Pope wants to see Islam in that positive kind of light. So we have a great commonness that we ought to be able to draw on in order to come to some sort of reconciliation in the Middle East. Of course, as we well realize, that isn't happening, and I think we need to get back to that conflict and to maybe try to understand it better and see what is causing all of it. But I want to set that framework of saying there is a theological commonness that we find in the Scriptures, in these three religious traditions, that ought to be able to be a basis for cooperation.
As you mentioned, Jim, in the Quran, there are many passages referring to the prophets from the Old Testament, as well as the Virgin Mary, Christ, and the Muslim been extremely tolerant of other religions in the Middle East.
Now, you experienced that growing up, right? Is that true? I mean, you were in Damascus, Syria.
Yes.
Predominantly a Muslim country.
Predominantly Muslim country. As a matter of fact, the whole Middle East, a predominantly Muslim region comprising, I would say, 90% of the total population is Muslim, and the remainder probably Christian. For instance, in Egypt, where the population is about 52 million, we'll see between 6 and 10 million Christians. In Syria, we see in a population of 12 million, we see approximately 1 to 1.5 million Christians in that part of the world.
And we also have little tiny segments of the Jewish community in the Arab world also, don't we?
Definitely, there is a small minority at the moment, Jewish minority in the Middle East, specifically in the city of Damascus. The city of Damascus.
Did you have Jewish friends when you were in Damascus?
Definitely. I went to school with many Jewish friends. I lived in the Christian quarter in Damascus, and the Christian quarter and the Jewish quarter were close to each other, and we attended with my Jewish friends a Christian school. As another point, several doctors were our family doctors, and they were Jewish doctors, and one of them is still alive. Took care of my family.
What year are we talking? What years are we talking about here, Eric?
Presently, we're talking about the present Jewish population in the Middle East in Syria is about 10,000 people, and I was referring to the time I was there in the late 50s, and before the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Jewish population was approximately 35,000. Majority of the Jewish population left Syria, mainly to the United States, to Europe, and to South America. Some very small minority went to Israel.
I see. And when would they have left there?
They left probably about the 48, early 50s, due to the conflict. But there is about 10,000 Jewish people in Damascus. Their life and their situation is really not different from other minorities in Syria or the general population in Syria.
I think it's important to remember that the kind of conditions that exist in Syria now, we seem to be centering on that, but it's an important part of the Middle East. Conditions there are very difficult, aren't they? I mean, I have the impression that it is a tightly controlled society, and that you certainly don't have much free movement. And I don't know about the question of religious liberty, though. How does that fit in?
Liberty for religion is adequate. There is no problem with that.
You have relatives that live there, yeah?
I have relatives who live in Damascus or throughout Syria and Lebanon, Jordan. And there is no religious conflict. There is no religious suppression in the Middle East, in Syria specifically, or other places. As you mentioned, there is no freedom as we know it here. The press is controlled. The population is controlled. Movement outside the country is not easy. People need to have special permission, special processing to acquire the liberty to leave the country and travel freely. So we do not see a similarity between here, what we see freedom and liberty. We see it in the Middle East.
Yeah, so we have a tightly controlled, and you said Middle East. In other words, we're not just in Syria, but
throughout the Middle East, almost similar. Yes, they are similar.
More tightly controlled society.
Exactly.
And really, would you not say that it borders on, well, I don't know if you say a theocracy? That is, in other words, put it this way: the distinction between church and state that we are very familiar with here in the United States is very foreign to the Muslim mentality. I've had dialogues with the Muslim students on our campus who really have trouble understanding this distinction between church and state. They seem to think that it all goes together, and in their own mind, in other words, religion and culture, politics, economics is really woven together in the Arab world. Am I correct in that assessment?
That's correct. You know, the Quran not only is a spiritual, but is also temporal guidance to the Muslim. At the early stage of Islam, the Caliph was not only a temporal ruler, but he was also a spiritual ruler. At the decline of the Islamic civilization, and specifically at the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Caliph as such stopped to exist. But still, as you mentioned from your conversation with the student here at the campus, in the Islamic country, religion and the spirituality as well as the day-to-day's activity are governed by the Quran or by
So, in other words, say you living as a Christian in Damascus in Syria, I take it that Friday would be the holy day for them, and that would be the day off and so on, and to suspend work, and then Sunday you would have your chance to go to church, but it would be a work day, I take it.
Yes, exactly. So the same, if we look at the Middle East as a whole, for instance, if we look at Israel, the Saturday is the Sabbath, is an off day in the Islamic country. We see the Friday in the Christian Lebanon. We see Sunday as an off day, the Sabbath. So
so we have
that
different
had
holy days.
different
yeah.
holy days, and this have not really generated that bigger conflict.
It wasn't a problem for you living as a Christian in a Muslim country.
Oh no, there was no problem for the Christians or any other minority to live in any of the Arab countries.
I know you often hear that they pride themselves on that sort of freedom of religion, and you actually experienced that. And was that same? Is that still true for your relatives living there? If they want to go to Christian liturgy on Sunday, they're able to manage that all right?
Oh, absolutely. You know, Islam been tolerant throughout history. Christians as well as Jew had their freedom throughout history under Islamic rule. The main, the Maimonides, one of the greatest philosopher of Judaism.
Moses Maimonides, that's how I usually pronounce it. Moses Maimonides, a middle-aged Jewish philosopher.
Yes, and he grew up in Andalusia, in Spain, under Islamic rules. So the Islam was extremely tolerant. If you go to the Middle East, say to Damascus or to Cairo or to Baghdad, you see churches, you see priests, you see people celebrating their holidays, their wedding, their funerals, and without any interference by the state or other religious sects, as a matter of fact.
Was there open dialogue at all between Christians and Muslims in Damascus? Was it my sense, again, in dealing with Muslim international students, is that they are extremely interested in religion. They love to talk about religion. They're very they get passionate about it. It's not like a curious, superficial matter for them. It's gut-wrenching. It's a matter of the heart as well as the mind, and they really get into it. However, the discussions usually would not be characterized by the word dialogue as we usually think about it. In other words, the kind of thing that we've grown used to in our own pluralistic country, where there's give and take, where we start out with the premise that we could learn from each other and that we cross over boundaries periodically and so on. I never got that particular impression in dealing with the Muslim students. They wanted to talk religion, but it was not in terms of that dialogue as we know it.
Well, again, it's the Islam as such, and if you visit the Middle East, you will hear 5 times a day the priest, the Muslim priest, the sheikh, calling people to prayer. You hear it everywhere, and you see people going to pray 5 times a day. This is part of life.
Was that with stores shut down at that time?
Yes, definitely. If you go to, say, Saudi Arabia, if you go to the Gulf states or Iran, some parts of Iraq or Syria, you see people leaving their stores open and going to the mosque for about 15-20 minutes and come back and continue their activity.
They would do that 5 times a day.
They do 5 times a day. Yes.
I wonder, what about some of their other religious practices? Does it end up influencing daily life, like their dietary laws and so on?
Ramadan, for instance.
Well, the holy month.
The holy month of Ramadan is a period where Muslims fast from sunrise to sunset. You don't see restaurants operating during that period of time. You don't see people smoking on the street or eating on the street. So the society is influenced by the religion throughout.
Could a Christian who owns a restaurant in Damascus stay open during Ramadan?
Well, you see, there is, Jim, there is a kind of a mutual respect for other people's religion and practices. Generally speaking, Christians who own restaurants or serve food will not do it till after the sunset. They'll celebrate and they open their restaurant for everybody to participate.
In other words, Islam is really the dominant cultural factor, in other words. And so if you're living as a minority in that country, there's a certain way in which you have to go along with the customs.
Yes.
Yes. That's interesting. How about some of the other, I know Syria is the country you know best, and you were giving us some breakdown there, but the dominant point is that the Middle East is by and large dominated by Muslim religion, and
Yes.
that there are minorities of Christians in these countries, and then just tiny enclaves of Jewish people living in these
Yes.
situations.
The predominant religion is Islam, but Islam is not monolithic. You have Sunni and you have Shiite. Sunni is comprises the majority of Muslims in, say, the Arab countries, while Shiite is predominant. The Shiites are predominant in Iran and maybe 50% of Iraq.
It's important for people to distinguish out Iran from the Arabic countries.
Yes,
Iran is not an
not
Arabic country.
Is a Persian country.
Yeah.
And within the Christian community, the Christians also are divided in many sects. They have Catholics and they have Orthodox. Again, the predominant sect in the Christian among the Christians are the Orthodox. And we have in the Middle East, we have the Greek Orthodox, we have the Syrian Orthodox, we have the Armenian Orthodox, we have the many
Yeah,
Orthodox.
well, in other words, what happens with the Orthodox Christian religions is they break down into national units. In other words, that's their standard practice.
That's correct.
So you'd have Russian Orthodox or
Yeah.
Greek Orthodox
or Syrian
Orthodox.
Armenian Orthodox.
Yeah, so each country would have its own sort of polity or grouping.
Ethnicity.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Right. Now, what about, are there unions in Syria, in Damascus also?
Unions.
Yeah.
The
ones that are united with Rome. In other words, you have a split between Orthodox Christians and Roman Christians, but then in most places you have unions. For example, in Lebanon you have the Maronite rite, which are really they're a distinct rite, R-I-T-E, a liturgical way of doing things, but they also are united with the Pope in Rome.
Exactly. We have, for instance, these ethnic religious grouping in the Middle East: the Greeks, the Armenians, the Syrians, the Chaldean. They were split later on. Some remained local, and they have their own patriarch, while the others aligned themselves with Rome. Mm-hmm. So units, grouping are in the Middle East. I would say there are about 8 groupings, from Maronite to Syrian Catholic to Catholic.
Like in Damascus, is that what you call them, Syrian Catholics,
Syrian Catholic,
as opposed to Orthodox?
And there are Syrian Orthodox. Syriac, actually. They have their liturgical rites. They have their specific language. The same thing as the Chaldean, the same thing as the Armenian. But they are aligned with Rome. The Pope appoints a cardinal or patriarch to that religious group, and they maintain their own.
How did the two Christian groups get along in Damascus?
Well, in Damascus is not as bad as Jerusalem. You know, in Jerusalem, the Holy Church of the Holy Shrines in Jerusalem had generated conflicts throughout history. Each grouping claimed one side or another to itself, and they couldn't manage to have harmony. And what they did at the end, they found a Muslim people to maintain order and maintain the religious shrine. For instance, in Jerusalem, the keys of the holy places is maintained by a Muslim family since the Crusaders left the Middle East. So a Muslim person, a Muslim family, takes care of the holy places in Jerusalem.
Tell me about this interplay between the Orthodox and the Unionists. I mean, someone was just telling me recently in Lithuania they would go into a cathedral and they would have at the same time going on a Catholic Mass at the center altar, and at the side altars they would have Orthodox liturgies going on at the very same time.
That's the same as in Jerusalem, not in other places in the Middle East.
Not in Damascus.
No, not in Damascus or in Cairo or in Baghdad. There, each church, each ethnic group got its own church.
Well, I still want to go back. We don't have enough time, though. I'm back on the question of how the Orthodox and the Uniates got along in Damascus.
They have each group got its own patriarch. The Catholic, they have their own, and the Orthodox, they have their own. As a matter of fact, the Orthodox patriarch came to Toledo. Several patriarchs in the past came to Toledo. And no conflict, to my knowledge, existed between the Orthodox or the Catholic, because they have their own separate.
So as you grew up, you didn't have a conflict.
No, I haven't seen. But again, I have left the Middle East over 30 years ago.
Yes.
And my knowledge or my current know-how of the Middle East is not as clear as it should be.
Well, Eric, you've been helping me and others to understand the Middle East. It's very complicated, and many of us have trouble sorting it all out. I mean, my perspective on it is the religious one, and that is that religions ought to bring people together. I keep getting back to the idea that the Bible is a common book for us. It links Jews and Christians together. The Quran has big elements from the Bible in it. We believe in one God. We respect each other's prophets. Islam respects Jesus. And we all look to Abraham as our father in faith. And so somehow in all of that we need to find our ways to dialogue and to cooperate. And I must find encouragement in your own experience of finding some degree of religious liberty, at least, living in a Muslim country.